Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Well, why don't we go ahead and begin? First of all, I want to just wish you all a very good morning. My name is Manny Oliva. I'm the CEO for Point Blue Conservation Science. I want to thank you for joining this exciting forum to discuss research opportunities to advance equity within the conservation efforts of California's 30 by 30 strategy. We are very happy to be serving as co-hosts for this forum in partnership with the California Biodiversity Network. So as an organization, Point Blue is dedicated to studying our natural world and sharing our science with the people and the institutions that can put this science into practice. We've been studying wildlife habitat and changing climate for over 55 years, and our 160 scientists across the state work with everyone, from federal and state agencies to private ranchers to local communities and schools, to help them implement sustainable solutions. Because we've worked with such a broad array of partners, we inherently understand the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice to be central within successful and long-lasting conservation outcomes. We also recognize that injustices in land use and management have resulted in inequities for many communities, including increased concentration of environmental pollution, limited access to nature, and loss of sacred lands. And the effects of climate change threatens to further exacerbate these inequities. The state's 30 by 30 strategy offers an opportunity to rethink our work, to rethink conservation, to create a new conservation movement that prioritizes the connection of everyone to their natural environment, as well as equity within decision-making and within the sharing of benefits. Conservation actions and policies ultimately are implemented by people. By increasing our ability to work with all communities, we will be able to scale the impact of our conservation actions in a way that we have not been able to do so before. As an organization, Point Blue is committed to this journey, and we are exploring how we can help amplify diverse partnerships, diverse perspectives, and elevate the voices of historically marginalized communities through increasing leadership of diverse voices within the science field, and expanding knowledge building and sharing, such as elevating traditional ecological knowledge. So today's forum is part of an ongoing discussion, or part of an ongoing series of discussions from the California Biodiversity Network to inform the state's 30 by 30 pathway report. An appendix to the pathway report is being created that is to provide an overview of existing science to support statewide conservation efforts and to summarize critical research and information gaps. Today, we will be identifying equity-focused research gaps, including the need to synthesize existing research, collect new data, and deploy new research in research areas. Before we begin, I want to again thank all of you for participating in this discussion, for your contributions to this very important discussion to increase and strengthen equity within our conservation efforts. So at this time, I want to turn it over to Dr. Ana Alvarez. She is the member of the steering committee for the California Biodiversity Network, as well as Deputy General Manager of the East Bay Regional Parks. Ana?
Thank you so much, Manny. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Bienvenidos, buenos días. This is a moment, and I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone here, because this is a key moment where all of us are coming together to have one more intimate conversation on these very critical issues. There's an opportunity here to be able to call out what we need to be able to resolve for very difficult issues, systemic and endemic issues that continue to provide very difficult barriers for practitioner agencies like the East Bay Regional Park District, the scientists like Point Blue Conservation Science, as well as academia and legislators. So I think that I would like to encourage all of you to take opportunity of this intimate conversation so that we can really have a candid conversation about what we need in terms of research that will inform future policy and legislation. I think the East Bay Regional Park District is delighted to be part of the California Biodiversity Network, precisely because we are truly a science-based organization in land management, and we're also at the front lines of climate change, which we see every day, its impacts on the land, on wildlife, and also on people. We're very much rooted in creating communities and understand clearly the value of open space to address quality of life issues in the most marginalized communities. So this is the convergence of science. This is the convergence not only of environmental sciences, social sciences, as well as understanding how to galvanize the spirit of people to protect the natural world, to save ourselves, and to continue to address these issues, and also for the merit of nature on its own. So again, I encourage you to have a candid conversation, take opportunity of the space and time in which the moment in which we're living together. And once more, thank you for joining this intimate conversation. At this moment, I would like to introduce Evie Sanders, who can tell us a little bit more about what we're doing with California 30 by 30. Evie?
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Alvarez. And to Blue Point, I echo the sentiments that were expressed around this is the moment for the convergence of all of these issues around social justice, civil rights, science, and environmental protection. I am a member of the 30 by 30 Advisory Committee, which was established to help execute Governor Newsom's executive order N 8220, which also established the California Biodiversity Collaborative and the committee that Dr. Alvarez and Mr. Jarvis helped to lead. The 30 by 30 initiative is part of an international movement that includes over 70 countries to protect nature across the planet. And in California, we're working to preserve and conserve our open space, 30% of that, of our open space and our coastal waters by 2030. The California Natural Resources Agency puts us at about 16% of our coastal waters already being conserved, and about 24% of our land. So we have a ways to go. But important to that are looking at three specific areas. And this is where I think this group really comes in, is protecting California's biodiversity, expanding equitable access to nature, and making sure that we ensure that the benefits of this access reach those who are most marginalized, and also working to help California achieve climate resilience and carbon neutrality. And so we are teaming up together, 30 by 30 and the California Biodiversity Network, to determine how we can actually implement and actualize this 30 by 30 goal. Part of that involves significant research and identifying new ways of approaching research and implementation that includes those who have not been part of the conversation, uplifting, as Manny mentioned, the traditional knowledge base that Indigenous people have for centuries used to steward our lands, making sure that a child who has never seen the ocean, who's never seen a sunset, has the opportunity to have access to nature, to improve their health, their mental well-being, their spiritual fulfillment, and make sure that all of us, not just an exclusive few, have the opportunity to experience nature for generations to come. And so with that, we have planned a number of breakout groups and dialogues around our work together, really focused and grounded specifically in equity. And so I'll turn it over to my colleague, John Jarvis, to talk a little bit more about what we're going to be doing next with our specific conversations focused on equity.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Effie, Anna, Manny. I'm John Jarvis. I serve as the co-chair of the 30 by 30 Advisory Committee with Effie and serve on the California Biodiversity Network Steering Committee with Anna. So I have a little bit of a hand in several buckets here as we go forward. I want to reemphasize a couple things before we launch into our breakout groups. This is a discussion about science. It's about data. It's about research gaps, information that is needed to accomplish the equity goals of the 30 by 30 pathways that will be laid out over the next 8 to 10 years in California. And I'm a big believer that, good science drives good policy. And so we conducted a series of roundtables with the Biodiversity Network, and equity was an overarching theme. So we did incorporate a number of equity, environmental justice, inclusion recommendations for research and data synthesis. But frankly, we felt there needed to be another look, a deeper dive into this topic so that we could better capture the depth and breadth of needs, of research needs. That set of recommendations will become an appendix to the 30 by 30 pathways document and become sort of the working list for the academic community, for the NGO community, for the environmental justice community and others to fill those gaps to accomplish the goals outlined in the 30 by 30 initiative. So that's kind of the framing for today's discussion, is not so much about policy, but a lot about research and data gaps. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Okay, in our discussions, we identified three thematic areas and one sort of large open discussion. And we're going to have breakouts in these four small group discussions next. And I'll just briefly touch on them. The first thematic area, which will be hosted by Ana Alvarez, is really the issue around mental and physical health that are created or problematic due to limited access to parks and open space that actually we know from the research result in a diminished life expectancy. And the second one is loss of land and control. And that is really about, as we all know, there was forced removal, there was disease, there were a number of historical practices of displacement in California, across the country, redlining. All of those resulted in a loss of land from the original owners and stewards of California. And 30 by 30 presents an opportunity to return some of those lands directly to the original stewards. The third topic is about gentrification. We all know that as cities gentrify, as we add new green spaces, it can result in displacement, particularly of communities of color, lower economic communities as well. And we need new models. We need new ways to do this, to provide open space, green space, parks without displacing communities. And then I will be hosting that one. Evie Sanders will be hosting the one on loss of land. And then the fourth group session is an open forum. We're not so smart that we've identified all the major topics. So this is an opportunity with Manny serving as a facilitator to have an open conversation about the issues that we really have not covered in the other three. So go to the next slide. So the process here is for you to choose which of these four categories, four groups discussions you would like to join. On your screen down in the bottom, you will see a little square image with a cross. And that is the process by which you can select the group discussion you'd like to join by clicking on that. You will be By hovering on the group that is identified, you will enter that group discussion, and we'll be in there for about 30 minutes. And it will be facilitated by the individual that I had already identified. And the focus will be, again, on identifying research gaps, need for synthesis of existing data, collection of new data, looking for new models that could work. And there will be notes being taken. The facilitator will ask for a volunteer to take notes. And then when we come back together, we will do a report out of each of these discussions. And then the one thing I want to commit to you, of course, is that we're capturing this information to synthesize it into the appendix report that will accompany the 30 by 30. So this isn't just a discussion to go nowhere. This is really hugely valuable to inform this process as well. Could you go back to the slide with the question there, right there? Okay, so this is sort of the guidance within your group discussion. These are the major questions. What research is really needed to advance equity in this area? Is there a need for new data? And what is that? What is that data? And what kind of data, what type of data would be the most important for resource allocation and new legislation? This is the idea of data driving policy, data driving funding allocation. And we need to look for the models of where this has been successful and the best practices. So if you can identify those as well, or do new models need to be developed as well? Okay, so I think the chat room is giving you some additional instructions about getting to your breakout session. But I think we're ready to go.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think everyone is back. I hope you had some great discussions. I know that our open forum, it was a wonderful discussion and great opportunity to learn and just explore these issues in a sort of deeper way. So at this point, I think what we were hoping to do is really go into a readout from each of the groups and talk a little bit about, so hopefully you've taken some amazing notes and assigned somebody that can take a little bit of a readout of the, for each group. So I don't know how much time we allotted for this section. I'm just making sure I have here in my little area that we have enough time for this discussion. But why don't we go ahead and start? Oh, thank you. 10 minutes for each group. Thank you, Jamie. So why don't we go ahead and start with each group? And one of the things that, and just to sort of in terms of from Effie's note in the chat about having time and the conversations, these are really important discussions that we're having, and I really appreciate the time you put into it. We may not have been able to capture everything, and we do want to continue that process. So we do want to encourage you, if you do have other things, we'll ask you to send us more information afterwards as well. So why don't we go ahead and start with the life expectancy discussion. Anna?
Yes, thank you, Manny. So we had yes, of course, there wasn't enough time. We had a very thoughtful conversation that can continue for even more hours as we started to dive into the issue. But very quickly, one area that was very clearly came out is understanding how to operationalize equity within NGOs and even other environmental agencies, including governmental agencies. While we understand the concept of equity and we have addressed these issues in the past, we need to understand how agencies can very quickly operationalize so that we can start taking down some of these, or addressing some of these barriers. The other piece is also the, in terms of the science, lack of access to the outdoor. We do have studies. LA County is a perfect example. We understand very detailed data with an academia partner like UCLA of the loss of life expectancy in communities of color. And that's also true in other locations within California. But now we're looking on how to aggregate that data, how to do not only the aggregate data for the state, but do a layering of that data with very specific health outcomes. And in doing that, we also need to have a repository of that data that anyone can access and someone to maintain that repository of data. In terms of establishing the need to establish a model that integrates standards and criteria for meaningful engagement of communities of color that leverage multiple benefits or multiple outcomes, not just being part of the process in planning for a restoration or new park development, but the additional outcomes in a comprehensive view that brings education to the participants on the natural resources that they're trying to manage or the need for the open space so that they can be good stewards of that land and opportunities for them to have meaningful roles in being those stewards that can lead to an academic partner to encourage, especially the youth, to get involved in the environmental sciences for higher education pathways that will lead to green jobs in the environmental industry that would address also the issue of not having enough diverse labor market to diversify the workforces in the environmental and park industry. Additional pieces that were discussed include, and I mentioned how to operational equity within the organizations and the need for investment. We know we have data already in place, so we need to understand why the data that has not driven the policy and has not driven the change that we need in organizations. So understanding, and it may be a lack of investment and lack of prioritization. So we need to have a study that speaks forward or brings forward to light the lack of investment in researches and lack of investment in operationalizing the science that will lead to legislation and policy. On a fiscal perspective within the state, we need to have a greater accountability and transparency that speaks to the park bond money that was delivered to or with the intention to be invested in local communities to address these issues. We want to understand how much of it has been issued and was the engagement and the tactic effective. And that's a piece that we never see. While the dollars may have been allocated, we never see back whether or not that particular program from a particular organization was actually effective, so that we can start creating those models that others can duplicate. And in terms of understanding the fact that we're lacking advocacy, again, NGOs and other environmental agencies are having to advocate at the state level for very basic notions, very basic programmatic investments. And so the question comes to light, is that really the burden of the NGO, or is that we need to understand why cannot that be adopted within the state? And then what is this, how is the state addressing this issue? So again, issues of transparency and clarity in creating the systems and organizational capacity to very quickly address issues of equity. And one piece that was not discussed that I would like to add is the fact that we did have one organization that works with incarcerated youth, and the fact that the state is utilizing incarcerated populations to fight wildfires. And a study will be very much needed or to bring to light this issue. We would like to understand how long has this practice been in place? And we also understand that after they complete their sentence in these incarcerated correctional facilities, especially communities, individuals of color, are not able to be gainfully employed in firefighting at the firefighting front. So we need a study that can bring this issue to light and understand what are the barriers, since they're being trained by the state and they're effectively mitigating for wildfires. So we are creating a workforce for wildfire fighting within communities of color, because they're tapping into the correctional facilities, the incarcerated populations. So why are we not able to continue with that forefront outside the correctional facility? I welcome anybody else who would like to speak from the small group, from my group, if there's anything that I may have neglected to bring forward. Anyone? You could raise your hand. No? Zach, I don't see anyone, do you?
Hi, Elviana's Prevention Institute. I think you did a great job, Anna, and I would just want to mention that, you know, the conservation field is a bit behind in terms of its trajectory, in terms of embracing and operationalizing equity at scale. And I think this is an issue that cuts across all of the 4 questions that were asked today. And I think that what really needs to happen is really some, not only do we need to increase procedural, distributional, and structural equity for the most marginalized communities, but there's also a need for the conservation field to look at itself and its capacity building needs in terms of this idea of operationalizing equity. That requires a tremendous amount of rigor and discipline. It also requires investment, but until we can sort of change the culture of the field, we're not going to be able to make a dent in addressing equity. And there needs to be research on all of these aspects. So while I was in the life expectancy session, I think this idea of loss of land and control, green gentrification, these are issues that have a lot of work that needs to be done to understand how we got to where we're at today in terms of inequities and what needs to be done within the field to change that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Elva. And that concludes the reporting out of the first small group discussion. Thank you, Manny.
Thank you so much. And it sounds like an amazing discussion. So I'll turn it over to Effie now, loss of land and control.
Great. I'm going to try and move as quickly as I can because there were some members of our panel, of our group, that didn't get a chance to speak. So we really focused on, and if you can see the Google document, you can follow along with that. But we really focused on kind of a general theme was that the dominant kind of culture in traditional environmental movements is perpetuating this colonial mindset and perpetuation of white supremacy, even with the land trust model. And so research around how conservation has to change. What are the barriers to Indigenous stewardship? Really mapping out what is the power, what has been the kind of power structure in terms of who has controlled conservation in California, who were on some of the land trust boards. How do we retell that kind of history with truth? Looking at Indigenous leadership models that may take longer to create, and instead of kind of focusing on these kind of arbitrary deadlines, like the kind of 30 by 30, you know, it's that everything's supposed to be done by 2030, really looking at Indigenous stewardship from a perspective that in order to determine how that happens, Indigenous folks need to figure that out for themselves. So where the state could help and put research dollars into supporting is having Indigenous groups and various tribes do this mapped-based ethnography work and understanding connections to land, migratory patterns, intermarriage, and stewardship opportunities. But one of the big things was capacity, and making sure that if we do pursue land back, strategies, that we ensure that tribes and Indigenous groups have the legal capacity, have the infrastructure, the financial capacity, and the human resource capacity to manage the lands and to steward the lands over time. So we're not looking at a situation where that loss happens again in the future. Also looking at the way in which we approach relationships with First Nation peoples from a perspective of recognizing tribal sovereignty and understanding the relationship is one that is more of a nation to nation relationship rather than throwing in, you know, everybody who the white dominant culture feels is different into this DEI structure. Other challenges included with land back were conservation easements and the restrictions around conservation easements, which then also run afoul of the whole concept of sovereignty. So I think more research into the history of what has occurred with conservation and trusts and those who have been in control and mapping of board members, and then support for Indigenous-led strategies for land back and future changes in conservations. I wanted to turn it over to others who didn't get a chance to speak, see if what I conveyed was accurate, and if there were other things that needed to be added, to please do so at this time. I'm not seeing any hands raised, but I'm not sure if I can see the full screen of everyone, Manny.
I don't see any hand, but so I'll ask anyone if they do, just if you can unmute and just offer anything. I want to make sure that we do capture any ideas that weren't captured. No, I think we're good. Oh,
Beth, would you mind sharing what you shared just in the chat? Beth, can you hear us? I don't know if she's able to. She added a few things in the chat, but I thought she may want to add some additional color to that.
okay. Well, thank you, Effie. Thank you so much. Wonderful work. So we'll turn it over to the next group. So John.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Effie, and Anna. There's some overlap here, as we probably expect, between our different group discussions, and a lot of our discussion was around community engagement and new models to actively engage communities in the creation, design of, implementation of new parks in these park deficient communities. I was fortunate enough to have Madeline Drake, who also serves with us on the California Biodiversity Network, to take notes. So I'm going to pass it to Madeline to talk about the specific recommendations from our group.
Great, thank you, John. So starting with some of the important research questions that our group had a great discussion around, some of the important things that we brought up were the fact that there's efforts already out there to get local communities, youth, and people of color involved in conservation, but a lot more research needs to be done on how effective these programs are. Are we seeing changes in the workforce? Are we seeing changes in the way people utilize and steward the lands? So really understanding how effective are these programs that are out there, and can we build on them and improve them and have even more in the future? Another is thinking about land that is improved. Oftentimes you see a lot of gentrification, and so there's an interest in, are there great anti-displacement measures that can be implemented to avoid gentrification in the future? Also, for programs that are specifically for access and providing funds for access, it would be great to have research on who's utilizing that land, both pre and post funding, so that we have a better idea of, is that funding actually working to increase access on lands? Other things we talked about were improved signs and involvement in community, and if sort of improved outreach and communication is leading to sort of an improvement of utilizing the land and stewarding the land and being part of the land. And finally, another last research question are sort of, what is the minimum critical finance that really needs to be in place for a park to be successful, for a lot of different reasons, for management, for community involvement. So sort of a bigger question of, what are the economics that have to go into thinking about whether conserved land is successful. So thinking about what types of new data we need and what would be really helpful is, it would be really helpful to know who to partner with in these communities to get the information that we need and sort of build trust. So who are the best partners? We had some people who had examples of working with a small church in the community to get more people involved in birding opportunities, or working with your local YMCA. So some great examples there, but really needing to scale that up. Also the idea that we need more on how does the community derive the priorities, and sort of what is a good model there and how can that be scaled up. In terms of sort of resource allocation and potential legislation, the issue, and I know that other groups have already brought this up, is sort of local capacity and what that means and how that can be built up through additional allocations, and then to even identify what technical assistance means as the state so that that can actually be implemented and improved upon moving forward. So I already mentioned some great models that our group came up with that worked really well. Some additional ones are showing how people can connect with nature, really using some Indigenous knowledge as well for this, but really sort of how they can interact and utilize it in ways that they might not have known before. And so just making that a little bit more clear. And then also this mindset of getting out of the top-down approach and getting into this more, how do we get shared priorities from the local communities and doing that better and scaling that up. Early, often outreach came up as other considerations that need to be brought up in all of this. And then, as always, more funding is needed for this sort of idea of continuous management and outreach for natural resources to both sort of get people involved and improve the lands. So I think those were the high level, but if anyone from my group, if I missed anything or miscategorized anything, please feel free to speak up.
Hey, good overview, Madeline. This is Doug. I did just want to add something from the very beginning of the discussion about training local young people through Conservation Corps in particular, which is something that the East Bay Regional Park District is helping with Oakland Civic Corps and others around the Bay Area. And that's, we agreed that maybe there are some research needs to kind of determine the outcomes from such efforts and figure out the best way to really groom those potential career pathways through trainings.
That's good, Doug. Yeah, that's a good one. Any other comments from our group? Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, John. And so for the final group, the open forum group, I'm going to go. We have the notes, and I'm going to sort of just talk about this at sort of the high level. And this really was other areas that we felt weren't really covered in the other three topics. And in terms of the sort of the questions, the guiding questions, we're really looking at here sort of the research, and this is somewhat arbitrary in terms of what research is needed in data collection, how I divided this. In terms of the research needed to advance equity in this area, we were looking at sort of what research is available in terms of diversifying both the science fields in terms of how science and research is sort of done and prioritized and how it's built, as well as how including diverse people, including people with different ways of knowing, affect the ecological outcomes or the way that the implementation of restoration work, for example. But there's also a lag of research in terms of a lot of this information that may be available in this focuses on positive outcomes and maybe not enough research on sort of the lessons learned and the negative sort of outcomes to this. And then we talked a little bit about traditional ecological knowledge, and it would be useful to find research in terms of how to synthesize this work that includes the combination of sort of Western science and traditional ecological knowledge, and way that would be helpful to sort of see how we are taking these two streams of work and creating sort of better lessons learned and sort of keeping them distinct in a way, but integrating the information at the same time and understanding that there's a wide variety of sort of practice in terms of very different Indigenous communities around this. We did talk a bit about community science efforts, and there was a couple of areas here that we were focused on. One was sort of the idea that a lot of the data that is collected through these efforts isn't necessarily getting back to the people that are participating, and how do we sort of make sure that that is there a way to sort of, there's a gap here in terms of dashboards or other ways of these participants of getting this data back, this actionable data back, and sort of owning the outcomes. And then there was the other question around who is participating in these kind of efforts, and is it possible to sort of get or glean demographic information to identify like how the diversity of the members who are participating. We did speak a little bit more about traditional ecological knowledge, like how its sort of inclusion does affect outcomes, and not just outcomes, but the way practices are being done. And there was a really good point about that there globally, there could be some really wonderful lessons learned from a lot of the other sort of communities that are doing this work. And then finally, in terms of sort of more the data questions, you know, around ecology, there is sort of this social sort of equity. To reach social equity, can we incorporate social equity or social issues within the equations, within sort of how we consider the balance of what we're trying to achieve, and not just sort of just the ecological kind of elements to the to sort of how we plan these and the equations that are being used to develop sort of these actions. There was a really good point in terms of resource allocation and legislation. Access to green space, there's a difference, and sort of access to, like, is it just access to a green park, a good park, or is it access to high quality nature? And what are the potential benefits and, for example, health outcomes from these different kind of access that people may receive? And then also there's this idea of that how a lot of monitoring is going to be required to make sure that equity outcomes are being met, and ways to sort of how do we sort of identify and monitor these equity outcomes. In terms of the right models, really just looking at the human element more as really part of the natural system and not thinking about it as a separate kind of a very distinct element. And how, you know, who is involved in this conservation work, and putting them as central, like putting people involved essentially in terms of the way the work is done and the outcomes. And just again, moving away from this paradigm that, and we've heard a little bit about this, that it's not real until there's this research, that there's this very structured research, but out of how to actually incorporate the knowledge that people hold, and sort of the way in the different ways that communities hold this knowledge. So I hope that I've captured most of the ideas. If anybody from the group would like to add or anything to what I said, please feel free to do so. And I don't see any hands or anything. So that is, you know, essentially the readout of all of these groups. And perhaps maybe at this time, either Anna or John, you could talk a little bit about sort of the process moving forward so that everybody is aware. And I think we can sort of close out this particular screen in terms of outcomes being shared. And thank you all for sharing. And yeah, maybe Anna, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Manny. Well, we've thank you for everyone for contributing. I think one of an important notice should be that all of this information is going to be synthesized by John and I to incorporate as much as we can into the appendix of the California 30 by 30 pathways. And those are the next steps. I should also mention that when we embarked in creating the research gaps appendix to this report, we did have 4 roundtables that have been from scientists, academia, and other practitioners who have been discussing many different issues around how to be successful in carrying out 30 by 30 from a science, from the science perspective. And equity was incorporated at the center of each of those roundtables. But we felt it was important to have one more conversation so that we can crystallize some of the concepts and the thematic, under the thematic areas that we identified today. John, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, that was very well done. I would just add that once this is complete and the 30 by 30 final pathways document rolls back out, it's in revision now based on the public comments and based on the advisory committee's input. It will be finalized and roll out. I don't know exactly what the timeline is. It's probably going to be sometime early summer when it comes out. Our hope, my hope, I think all of us, is that the appendix will be a working list of opportunities to invest from the state, from the philanthropic community, from the NGO community and others to fill in these gaps. That it isn't just a report that we hope sits on some dusty shelf, but a real document, a live document that helps us really invest in this in a way that results in the three major goals of the 30 by 30 initiative that are biodiversity conservation, climate resilience, and equitable access to nature.
Thank you, John. And so just to close out with Manny, please do, if you, we didn't have enough time to carry out these conversations to the full extent, but we do appreciate the time that was invested in just getting ourselves into brainstorming on what are the most critical gaps that we see immediately from the appendix. You still have an opportunity to provide us with additional information by emailing before Monday, February the 21st. Yes, before Monday, February the 21st. Please do feel free to reach me. There's my email. Please write me an email. Let me know what's in your mind. John and I will be synthesizing this information and bringing it back to the California Biodiversity Network Steering Committee so that we can continue modifying this living document. And again, just to reiterate, because it's really important what John said, this is a living document that will inform the investment of either private donors, the state, academic institutions, or environmental practitioners into conducting some of this research as we continue to embark in a 30 by 30 initiative. So thank you everybody for coming in. Manny, would you like to close us out?
Yeah, again, I want to thank you, Anna, thank you, Effie, and thank you, John, for participating in this and for leading these discussions. And I just want to thank everyone for participating. These are incredibly important discussions. The fact is that we will not achieve the conservation outcomes that we need to achieve without equity being central to this effort. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to partner with the California Biodiversity Network in doing this, and we're very happy to be part of this community and to have this discussion with all of you. So thank you all very much. And there is information on Point Blue Conservation Science if you're interested in learning more about our work. Again, thank you all. And at this point, we will be ending a few minutes early. So look at that, look a few minutes early to take a break for all of you. So thank you very much. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.